All right, well, welcome back for the last one I had planned on Judaisms, and it's actually just a little bit of a mishmash together to like do a couple of things you may or may not find interesting, but also like questions and comments and concerns. And obviously what I don't get to do is have you walk away like understanding what it's like to be a Jewish person in Clear Lake or anywhere else in the world, but hopefully a little bit broader about festivals and history and sort of what the major things you look forward to in your Jewish life. Now, I do have to tell you, I'm going to be gone next week at clergy conference, and that's mandatory, so I don't have an option. And then I'm going to be gone at a food collaborative, and then I'm going to be gone taking a backpacking trip. So this is working out really well that we've got a natural break, and then we'll come back in 3 weeks. And it's sort of up to you because you're the ones here. I'm very happy to talk about Islam or Christianity. To be honest, at least Christian history might be interesting, and sort of denominations might be interesting for you or not. But you may say, I already understand Christianity. I can tell you I don't personally. So it may be worth our time, but it may not. It may not. Okay. If you're interested, I'd like to give it a go, and I'll probably be more academic than you want, but you can rein me in. It'll be the 15th, Betty. It'll be the 15th.
Thank you.
So the 15th of November, and you'll see that in the e-news. You'll see it in the e-news. Again, I just have 3 things in a row, and I don't have a good sub. You know, like I'm kind of want to do it my way. So I don't know who else wants to do it my way.
Thank you.
Okay, first I thought I would do some show and tell, and you probably already have seen these. This is what you would expect to wear as a man in a synagogue. Women do not wear these in general, right? And this is a head covering to show at least your devotion before God. So if you're going to go into a synagogue as a man, there's loners. And if you didn't wear this, it'd be horrific, right? Like it's just a thing that you do. If you're Jewish, you probably wear these around if you're Orthodox, although you wouldn't know because it's usually underneath the black hat from the Polish nobility of the late 1700s. If you're conservative, you may wear this around, you may not. It depends. My brother, who's Orthodox, often wears this, but wears it under like a baseball cap. So you wouldn't necessarily know. The point is not to be flamboyant. You're not advertising, I'm Jewish and you're not. It's to cover your head as a sign of where you stand below God, right? It's a show of humility. If you wanted to go to the Western Wall in Israel, that's where this one came from, and it's printed as such. To approach the wall, it is expected that men wear these. If you're Reform, you probably wear it in the synagogue, and that's about it. Other thing I have is a prayer shawl. Reminder, this is a talit. These can be colored, they can just be white, they can be anything. Sometimes they'll have Hebrew script on them, sometimes they don't. But a reminder is that this is what you would use for prayer in synagogue on a Saturday. It's not, it's very rare you would walk around with one of these on unless you were doing some kind of function. So again, this is kind of like you get married under a chuppah, which is a canopy, and here you find yourself under a canopy, and there are 613, not necessarily, well, I'm trying to think of this as strands in this one. Sometimes it's knots. And as I mentioned to you, if you've seen Fiddler on the Roof, you've seen sometimes it can be worn as a shirt and these come out. You'll see the tzitzit or the tassels come out underneath a dress shirt or just a regular shirt. That would be more, again, that you'd see somebody wearing that shirt. It probably either Sephardic or Orthodox or Hasidic, and in general, like if you're Sephardic, then you probably are Hasidic. So not likely to be seen in our area, somebody wearing one of the talit shirts, because we've got the conservative synagogue and we've got the Reform. again, if somebody probably came from, say Russia or Eastern Europe, they might wear this as a cultural practice, even though that doesn't necessarily happen often in conservative reform synagogues.
Men and women, or just
No, this is men.
Okay.
Same with the head covering, right? So just as a reminder, women have a head covering, you just don't know it because it's a wig. And that's called a shadel.
Well, and I hope this isn't off the subject, but I grew up Catholic. The Catholic Church would the girls always had something on their heads.
Like a bonnet, yeah. I mean, that's
I mean, if you forgot your hat or whatever.
Sure, right, and that's also meant to be, that's a funny thing, right? I mean, that happens, but that is an old tradition. I mean, when you look at the Virgin Mary, what do you know? She always has on a shadel. That's the Hebrew word for hijab, which is the Arabic word, and it's a head covering, right? And it is true. I was the first Episcopal church that I was like a true member of. We had a number of refugees from Burma, Myanmar. They had become Anglican in refugee camps, actually. And in San Diego at the time was had more refugees than any city in the country. It's actually Houston now, in case you're interested. And they deposited them, these Burmese Myanmar folk, along with Sudanese, in the area where our church was. So there was this big group of people who English was like their fourth language. And sure enough, they came to church because they became Anglican in the camp. And when it was time to come to the rail, they all put on a veil, like a lacy sort of veil, that you might see that in like Italian Catholicism, or in Spain. You might see like a veil at the Eucharist, particularly, certainly at a funeral, right? Like women covering their head is not new, right? Not new. And sometimes we think about Arabic people as like only Muslim people do that. But again, like no, Jewish women do it. You just don't know because it's a wig.
Well, when I was growing up, and the Episcopal Church always wore a hat.
Yeah, that was the same.
Women did.
Yeah. And then Jackie Kennedy came along with her lace and tiara thing, and and then at one point, gosh, it's kind of nice not to have to wear it.
Yeah, I think I've only got 2 parishioners that wear hats regularly. And of course, men don't wear hats. Like this is an old tradition, right? Men don't wear hats, except that there are 3 clergy hats. One has the poof on it, that's called the beretta. The other is called the zucchetta, which is one of these. And then the third is the mitre, which is like, you got to be a bishop to wear the mitre. And our bishops don't usually wear the mitre because they're kind of low church. I mean, they are like by choice. That's what they are.
I think it's sad because Catholics here that both went to Catholic school. Neither of us has any idea why we were wearing those things. Every time we went to church.
Yeah, every time, and
A sign of respect.
I guess it was a sign of respect. You didn't
But
know.
it was not optional.
No,
No,
it was
no.
not.
Well, and consider how like culture, I mean, the culture of hats is really funny, right? Because what are you supposed to do when it's time to sing the national anthem? You take off your hat, but in church you put your hat on. Now that makes no sense, does it?
And they're both supposed to be signs of respect.
And they're both
Take off the
signs
hat
of
when you're-
respect, yeah.
I remember at George VI's funeral, seeing who was the Queen Mother and the 2 princesses, and they were draped in a black. You couldn't even see their faces as respect. I remember that well. Long time ago.
Yeah, and it's actually interesting. I don't know if you're familiar with how patriarchs in the Orthodox tradition dress, all black, and they have this kind of headpiece that covers the back of their head, at least, like it kind of drapes down. That's probably more like what folks were wearing at the time of Jesus in the Jewish tradition. That would have been maybe not necessarily the priestly dress, but the Pharisaical dress. So the Orthodox tradition has sort of stayed more in the ancient Near Eastern roots. What the Roman tradition did, we can talk about this in 3 weeks. They adopted essentially clothes of the Roman nobility. So when you see like the alb and the chasuble, that's what rich folk were wearing in the Roman period. And we've just kind of kept that in the church tradition ever since. They didn't mean anything special. I just want to be really clear. There's not like, nobody's like, oh, there's this tradition about sacred garments. No, there isn't. There isn't. That's just like what other priests and nobles were wearing. It's not like we cook that stuff up. And so it's like a good reminder. The first week I put that word on the board, syncretism. We all do it. And sometimes we hate to think we do it. We all do it. There's limits to it, and I guess we have to pick, right? But it's this interesting thing, like, did the temple really get destroyed on the same day, 590 years apart? I mean, I don't know, but that's tradition. Was Jesus born on December 25th? I mean, there's a 1 in 365 chance. But I tell you, like, they picked that day because it was a pagan fertility festival and it had green trees in the middle of winter. And what do you know? We still have all that stuff. So, syncretism. We don't have winter in Texas. Yeah, it depends. We had it yesterday, maybe.
I was just wondering if some of those traditions of wearing, the various headgear and so forth was actually a practical thing that was adopted by the church. For example, maybe the sun was too hot in the Sahara Desert. And
Yeah.
they wore these things for self-preservation, and it became adopted as a norm.
I mean, maybe, right? Maybe, but like clothing is not always practical, even including clothes we're wearing now, right? Like it has these weird trendy roots or, so it's probably always a little bit of this and that. And I would tell you that these can look, just for example, these can look really, really different. I've seen sort of Russian jewelry where like red velvet ones, that's kind of flamboyant, right? And wear essentially white clothes instead of the Polish nobility wearing black. And that exposure came to me in Jerusalem, but not on the regular streets. It's just a reminder, right? Like Jews were forced to live in ghettos, but at a certain point, there are like homogenous Judaica communities because of whether or not you're allowed to walk or drive to your synagogue. So you may not know this, in Houston, there was an old Jewish neighborhood called Riverside Terrace. Is anybody familiar with this? Jewish folks were not allowed to buy or live in River Oaks. They were redlined out of River Oaks. So essentially they made their own River Oaks, Riverside Terrace, which is now the 288. So the 288 destroyed Riverside Terrace, but they were sort of plantation style homes like you'd see in River Oaks, like on 2 acres of property with giant front lawns and even closer to downtown than River Oaks in some ways, right? I mean, the 288's like, it's right there. And what do you know? There's not a synagogue there because they decided to build a Jewish school first. That was the big need. And then there was some infiltration that happened into the neighborhood. There's actually a long documentary about it. Essentially, somebody crossed the color barrier and then there was white flight. And, 10 years later, the 288 runs through that neighborhood. Now, the people who built my home here in Nassau Bay lived in Riverside Terrace and they fled because 2 or 3 Black families moved into the neighborhood. So this is an interesting thing that happens, right? But again, they built this particular school so that their kids could go to Hebrew school before they built their own synagogues. The school's there, but the synagogue and the painfully long documentary, if you want to watch it. I was younger than I am now once upon a time, so I watched that. Okay, a couple other things I brought for show and tell. I mentioned this to you last week. This is traditional bread that you'll see 51 weeks out of the year on Shabbat. So I don't pretend to be like a Jewish baker, although I'll tell you this is parve, which means you can eat it with anything because there's no dairy in it, right? So again, parve means There's like no restriction to consider. This is challah, and it's made from 6 strands that you sort of weave together. There's nothing magic about it. They don't consecrate it. It's not like the Eucharist, but it's a staple at a Friday night Shabbat meal. It's an enriched bread. It has eggs in it, and it also has oil. So that gives it an enrichment, and it has an egg wash on it. And sometimes you put salt or you put sugar, and some people may put currants in it. This is just regular old challah. If you're interested to see what it's like bread, but I think it's beautiful. Like it turned out quite well. So I don't have butter. I thought I would. Butter, of course, is not parve because you can't combine it with meat, right? So you have to be mindful of that. But I don't have any. So anyway, if you're interested, please help yourself. I thought I did, and it got cleaned out of the fridge. So this is what you would see on a Friday, and normally there'd be a little doily on top of it. That might be linen, or it might have some lace, and often it'll have this letter sheen in it, like you'd see on a mezuzah for the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Every Shabbat home and family tradition's a little bit different, but there are a couple of blessings that are pretty standard, and they sort of come, and you if you've been around Jewish services, you've probably heard these before. They almost always start with Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King or ruler of the universe. So this is like a normal kind of beginning to a Jewish prayer or a Jewish blessing. And on Shabbat, it happens 3 times. As I mentioned to you, it begins with lighting the candle. So you would normally say something like, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. I memorized them in song form, so I have to go back to like, how do I recite them? Oh, do you want me to sing them?
Yep,
Sure. Okay, so and it's interesting, there's all kinds of melodies, so there's not one way to sing these blessings, right? Like some of them are in a minor tone, and some of them are celebratory, some are set to kids' music. So like if I sang the one, there's not necessarily that the Jewish home would recognize it. They might have a different hymnody, if that makes sense. The candles is like probably the most minor. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lahadlik ner shel Shabbat. So that would be the blessing over these candles that you allow them to burn completely all the way to the ground, right? I didn't bring any wine because wine is wine. We typically don't use port like we use at the Eucharist. We use port because it's enriched and has a slightly higher alcohol content, right? So the goal is to try to up the antiseptic quality. And the other reason, right, is that port doesn't go bad like wine does, right? Like wine, you got 3 days basically before it really starts to taste funny. So because there's brandy in it, it doesn't go so bad so fast, right? And so the wine goes into the silver cup, which is a kiddush. It's usually a family heirloom if possible, like great grandma's kiddush is like a nice thing that you have, right? Reminder that the man blesses that, and that's a different one. Starts the same way. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Berei peri hagafen. So for giving us the fruit of the vine. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Berei peri hagafen. Amen. As I mentioned, that would circulate the table. And then you might actually have dinner. You may be eating before the children kind of bless the challah. And I only know the children's version of that. I mean, if you were going to say it in Hebrew. So my brother is Orthodox, as I mentioned. He was conservative first. There's no singing in his home. in his home, they're all just recited. Which is too bad. I like the songs. So.
Oh, I do too.
Yeah, he didn't want me singing those songs or teaching his kids those songs either. Anyway, that one is Chamotzi lechem min haaretz, for the bread that comes from the earth. We give thanks. I mean, essentially, that's what you say, and also Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Chamotzi lechem min haaretz. Amen.
Mm.
Right. I'll sing that song. That's my favorite one. Hamotzi lehem min haaretz. We give thanks to God for bread. Our voices rise in joyful chorus as our simple prayer is said. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lehem min haaretz. Amen. And then children would eat that, right? And sure, you could eat it with butter as long as there wasn't meat on the table, right? And so this is like an interesting element in the kosher home. It's not like you can take a piece of challah and slather it with butter and eat that, and then switch plates and then like have a big piece of beef or something, right? Because that you're sort of mixing the dairy with the meat. Maybe not on the vessels, but they're not supposed to be immediately consumed together if you're observing kashrut or kosher. There's other prayers. You know, it depends what frankly, your piety or your family tradition is that can make the Shabbat at home sort of be longer. And sometimes everybody has a recitation. Sometimes it's just sort of the father and or the mother that sort of say these prayers.
Is there a prayer book?
There is, it's called a Siddur. And like when we went to the synagogue over here at Shar HaShalom, they have Siddurim in the pews. I mean, essentially the Book of Common Prayer. And what's in the Siddur? The readings, as I mentioned, I think they're called Parshat instead of the Revised Carmen Lectionary. The Torah is split up according, like seasonally or according to holy days. That's in the Siddur. And then there would be like Shabbat prayers in there. Usually there's Hebrew next to English in this country because even though you might learn how to recite Hebrew at your bar or bat mitzvah, it doesn't mean you're fluent in it. You know, you essentially might just be reciting. So it depends on your community and how well, you know, how well steeped they are in Hebrew. I mean, some communities like might be fluent in Yiddish, but aren't fluent in Hebrew. But synagogue services happen in Hebrew, not Yiddish. I don't know if that makes sense.
Word, if we go back 300 years, before Hebrew came about again,
Yeah.
okay? What language would the Torah be written in?
Yeah, it still would have been in Hebrew, but like most people not understanding super well. I mean, what's the best analogy? Latin today, or even better, maybe Sanskrit, right? There's people who are fluent in Sanskrit, but your average Hindi has no idea, right? I mean, you learn sacred syllables like Om, right? But does anybody know what Om means?
No.
Well, it doesn't mean anything.
Oh.
It's a sacred sound. Like that's how the world was created. What's it mean? Meaning is irrelevant. Like it's the actual sound and the resonance that matters, right? It's like a way in which you sort of connect with the universal ordering spirit. So it's interesting to think through. Like for us, words have to mean stuff, right? And like in the Eastern tradition, they don't have to mean anything at all. It can just be about like sound therapy.
That would be why the monks would get the drum off back then.
Yeah, or you know, there's a certain point in chant, right, where like, does it really matter what you're chanting? I mean, I guess you could say it does, but like chant does something else in our brain, right? Like it's like not necessarily linguistic based. It starts to become, and it's interesting what music does to our brain. Depends who you read. It's very weird. Evolutionary, where it comes from is up for debate too. Yeah. And so I actually wish I had more of the rich Jewish musical tradition to share with you. I don't. Reminder to you that there's two traditions. There's the Ladino tradition, which is the Spanish Jewish tradition, which is not ubiquitous. It's far in the minority, right? And then there's essentially the Yiddish traditions. And what do you know? If you've seen Fiddler on the Roof, you get some taste, right? Like there's a different key at work. It's not a minor key, but you can almost spot it, right? Like it would be true, we don't use the word gypsy anymore. We prefer to use words like the Romer, which is a group that were in the gypsy tradition. But there's essentially like this kind of pathos quality to the music, right? If you've seen Schindler's List, Yitzhak Perlman helped compose and write and play that violin, and there is granted, he's the best violinist in the world, everybody knew that when he was doing it, but the violin sings with a wail, and it's still tragically beautiful. And so this is part of Jewish tradition, but don't think that it's all minor, because if you've been to a wedding, it's not all minor. There's these crescendos. And if you were here maybe last year on Yom Kippur, our friend came in and played something called Kol Nidre, which comes from the Ladino tradition. So it did make it into mainstream Judaism, but it's Ladino, and it's sort of this lilting and falling and ultimately falling piece that sort of sets the Yom Kippur liturgy in the synagogue in a number of places, and the musicality draws something out. It's meant to do that. So I don't really know how to put you in touch with that either, but it's lovely. It's lovely, and synagogues do employ people if they have the means. There are cantors, you probably know, just like we can't or chant. They're actually quite similar, right? At the 10:30 service, I do try to do some chant or cant, even though I'm not musically the best. It's just part of our tradition. There's something nice about it. And by the way, it's not supposed to be musical performance, which is why I'm okay doing it, because it's really meant to be this extrasensory, past your normal cognitive function way of engaging. So cantors exist. And as I mentioned, some people have not just the cantor, they have the chazan, and the chazan is somebody who's, depending how cant-oriented your synagogue is, the chazan is the prayer cant leader, and may cant the Torah out of the bima instead of it being read by the rabbi from the lectern. Sandra?
There's a Hampton synagogue that's on a lot. It's all male. It's pretty. But then Barbara Streisand sings this Malachi Avenue. That's a song that their singers sing that I think is pretty.
Barbara Streisand. Does anybody sing Yentl?
Yeah.
Oh, I guess there's a lot to it, and it's also Barbara, you were fooling nobody in that boy's clothes, right? Yeah, anyway. I curiously enough, I met on my Knowles course on sabbatical, one of the 11 people was a Jew from Chicago, and he was honestly part of he was a mystical singing Jew. And he would get together, he's 33, he's an attorney, he's in no way weird, right? In no way weird, very much a thoughtful, regular human being that you would enjoy having time with. Had this boisterous, almost outrageous laugh, but one of his favorite things in life was to get together with Jewish canting, singing groups, and for an hour or two to sing Jewish hymnody in this sort of mystical way. It was transporting for him. I had never met that person before. not specific, I mean, in general, but that exists. That exists. Like, it's not a drum circle. It's like elevated. So that happens, right? And look, like if you know people who are into Gregorian chant, like in general, people dabble with that, but like that was really meaningful for Christian monks. I mean, it kind of actually saved the monastic movement, because before that it was like all talking and vows of silence. Like this was how they were able to commune, I mean, essentially with God outside their bodies, right? So this happens. In Islam, normally you might expect that to be from I don't want to say the dervishes. The dervishes are part of the Sufi tradition, and Sufis are essentially mystical Muslims. They may not all do it through song. Some might do it through dance, or some might do it through meditation. But hymnody as like transcendence, it does exist in all religions. Again, I don't know how you find it, except like it's not for you to like listen to and enjoy. I want to be really clear. It's not performance. Like it's transport, right? So you can't, like, I want a CD on mystical Jewish chant so that like I can enjoy it. Like that's just nonsense. You enter into it or you don't.
It's like using icons to pray.
Yeah, I mean, I guess people can adorn their home with icons, like that's a thing, because they just like the art style.
What about Tizay? Oh, excuse me, Tizay.
Yeah, Tizay is like that for sure.
Yeah.
Tizay is like that. If you don't know about Tizay, this is like Jacques Bertak, I'm trying to remember, has kind of been working in France in the Tizay community to kind of come and what do you know, churches like to sing one Tizay song, right? Like, look at us, we're Tizay. But like that's not the Tizay community, is like hours of this at a time, and it's anyway. Oh, you probably have, you just don't know it. Like a couple of them make their way into the hymnal. We use some here sometimes, right? I mean, it's sort of like spirituals, right? Like there's like 4 spirituals in the hymnal, but they're nothing like the way spirituals were sung when they were invented, right? Like spirituals were sung like while you work. So they're really slow. And what do you know? They're very, 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 very repetitious. Very repetitious. Like I don't even like that degree of repetition, like, because my brain likes novelty. But there is this point in hymnody where the repetition is the point, because each time you hit it, you're supposed to sink, not go higher, you're supposed to sink deeper. Like each line is an invitation to go deeper and deeper, not necessarily into like the words, but like to become like spiritually descend into yourself. If that makes any sense. I don't know if it does. Modern praise and worship music. Is anybody familiar with this in the Christian tradition? Like Maranatha music or Hillsong. It's trying to do that. It's like outrageously repetitious, but without the actual like theology of sinking into yourself as you do it. That doesn't have traction with modern evangelicals. Like, and so there is something very emotionally cathartic about it, but there's not a theology of going deeper into yourself. Yeah, maybe that didn't make any sense. The other thing I gave you is, I mentioned this last week, the Seder. So this is the Haggadah, like the service that you have to have during Passover. I think I made enough copies. This is the one we used to do. And here, you'll notice that there's nothing in here about Jesus, because it's not about that, right? It's about actually instead retelling the story. I left some of the Hebrew, like, hey, what do you know? At the very beginning, when it says we light the candles, anytime you light candles in Judaica, you're going to essentially say the same prayer that I just sung to you, the very first one. And there it is in Hebrew transliterated, and here it is in English as well. I don't want to read through the whole thing, but if you're interested in sort of what happens at the Seder, again, there are things that must be on the table, specific herbs or pieces of food, and somebody has to ask, why is this here? Like, why are we eating flat bread? Like, this is really important, right? We eat challah all year. Why are we eating matzah this year? Hey, we eat butternut squash and we eat Brussels sprouts all year. Why are we only eating bitter vegetables this night? Maror is the Hebrew word for like bitter. It's usually like arugula.
Oh, yeah.
I happen to really like arugula, you know, but it is a little
Not my
bitter,
favorite.
right? Hey, sometimes we dip our vegetables once. Why do we dip them twice? Other nights we sit however we want. Why are we leaning on pillows? Now, keep in mind the original story, there was no leaning or sitting. People were standing up eating, right? Like stuffing their face before they left. But now we've decided, hey, like we don't have to eat standing up. So there's a different way of sitting that happens at the Seder, right? Maybe you know the song Dayenu? No?
Yeah.
This is a great song.
Can you sing it?
I can, yeah. So it's got a bunch of verses. It's on toward the last page, Dayenu. Very repetitious. And the word, it's really funny, like Dayenu is a really short word that kind of translates idiomatically to that alone would have been enough. And then you get to say all these things God did. And if you just taken out of Egypt, that would have been enough. If you just given us the Sabbath, that would have been enough. But like, there's got to be another verse. So it's sort of like, but wait, there's more, right? So Dayenu is like a litany of gratitude. And again, there's a lot of different tunes to it. If you're interested in something fun, I'm just going to put this up there. There is a group of there's like a Jewish boy band, and they're called the Maccabees. And they do this very fun version of the song Dayenu, where with each chorus, they sing it in a different musical style, ranging from the Beach Boys to like death metal to like barbershop. It's actually kind of sweet. You can find this on YouTube, right? If you type Maccabees Dayenu. Anyway, this is like there's like contemporary Christian music, and I just want to be clear, there's like contemporary Jewish music, like this happens. Okay, so the way I know it, the way I know the song, Dayenu, you repeat. So Dayenu, 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 and then you go into each verse. Ili hotzianu, hotzianu mi Mitzrayim, hotzianu mi Mitzrayim, Dayenu, 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 Dayenu. So that whole thing about Mitzrayim is God took us out of Egypt. So that's the first one. Again, each verse is another thing we're grateful for, and we're grateful. So it's a great Thanksgiving song.
Do they sing it in English or do they sing it in
Hebrew. Yeah, I didn't know a musical because it's really, so Dayenu is easy, it's short, right? Dayenu, 3 syllables. That alone would have been enough. For alone we are grateful. That alone would have been enough. That alone would have been enough. That alone we're grateful. That alone would have been enough, right? Like it's just sort of weird, right? And so it is like, if you've been going to church a bit, it's likely you've heard like some Greekisms thrown out, like what's that kind of like preachers love to talk about the kinds of love, right? Like there's eros and there's phileo and there's agape love, right? So like Christian people in general know the word agape, even though they don't know the word agape, right? Like it's this like charming Christian Greekism, that we pop pepper in. And the same if you're Jewish, right? Like you may not be super practicing or super fluent, but like you probably know Kiddush means cup, and you probably know that Dayenu means for that alone we would have been grateful, if that makes sense. Yeah, anyway, so feel free to look this through if you want. There's one thing I didn't tell you about, which is the afikomen. That's a piece of the matzah, and you hide it. This is like an Easter egg hunt, except there's only one. And the kids go around and look for it, and whoever finds the afikomen, like, it's kind of like breaking the wishbone favorably at Thanksgiving. You're not going to heaven when you die. It's not like that. It's like, like, oh, I found the afikomen this year. Like, I got my wish. Like, it's that sort of thing, right? It's more of a cultural tradition. You won't find any discussion of the afikomen in the book of Exodus or Deuteronomy, but it's become a tradition that happens at a Seder meal. What else are you wondering about? I may not even know. Yeah.
I have a friend who is a Sephardic Jew,
Oh, yeah.
and he's an atheist. I presume most of them are anyway. And he says, I don't know whether this is true or not, he says that there's no mention of David or King Solomon anywhere except in a piece that they found in 1936 or 37 in Israel. And he said the archaeologists are divided on whether that's authentic or not.
Yeah, so there's scholars who say David is like an amalgam, like he might be this kind of idealized monarch, and is he real or not? No one knows.
Like a King Arthur.
Like King Arthur, yeah, well done. Yeah, people say that. I mean, we certainly have evidence of, as I mentioned to you, after Solomon, the kingdom split, right? And the kingdom split south to Rehoboam, son of Solomon, and in the north, a guy called Jeroboam, no relation. And pretty soon after Jeroboam was this guy called Omri. And we know Omri was real because he's on the Moabite stone, which was found in Ammon and sadly destroyed, but we at least got a copy of it before it was destroyed. So there's a couple external references. Biblical archaeology is a funny business. In the late 1800s, most of it was done by French people, actually. And so like in the late 1800s, there was this kind of idea that you could have the Bible in one hand and a shovel in the other and sort of go to the Holy Land and prove it all happened just like it said, but it's like all real inconclusive. I mean, there's all kinds of weird stuff that people have found. And, like maybe we're just missing the major dig that corroborates all the stuff we want it to. But as I mentioned, it's Christian fundamentalism is new. It's like 100 years old. In some ways, it's influenced most churches, especially in the West. Christian fundamentalism has, so much so that we think everybody must think this is like a textbook, this is a history book. It's a new way of reading the Bible. I don't want to say people didn't care whether it was factual or not, but I'm going to say people didn't care whether it was factual or not. Like that just wasn't a way of perceiving the world that mattered. Myth doesn't mean made up. Myth means a story about the deeper nature of things. So there's the mythic reading of Scripture is the older reading of Scripture. The factual reading of Scripture is brand new. And how do you impose a factual reading on Scripture when the people who wrote it didn't have a factual mentality? Right? Like that's silly. It's silly. But we've swallowed it. We've swallowed it so deeply that if somebody says, hey, this story doesn't have to be true to be the truth, like our postmodernist brains don't like to hear that. Well, it can only be true if it's factual. Well, that's nonsense. We know that deeply. You know that To Kill a Mockingbird did not happen. Does it truly describe like some of our history? I'd say so, right? Like that story has a lot of truth in it, even though it's not factual. well, the Bible's different. Is it? I don't know. I mean, it depends. It depends on what you do with it. I mean, certainly the Bible is different for a lot of reasons. It's got an older track record. It's been passed down carefully and lovingly, right? We talk about this as a story of God's people, but is God bound by our understanding of factuality and truth? Now, these are deep questions. And so I actually have a quintessential rabbinic story I want to share with you about this. Once upon a time, there's two rabbis having an argument about whether an oven is kosher or not. This is a very Jewish story. So Rabbi Gamaliel says, no, it isn't because of blah, blah, blah. And Rabbi Akiva says, yes, it is because of da, 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 right? And so they're having this disagreement, and Rabbi Akiva says, yes, it is. And then what do you know, like the clouds open and a beam of light shines on Rabbi Akiva, and the light is rainbow colored to be flamboyant. Clearly, Rabbi Akiva is correct, right? Well, Rabbi Gamaliel goes back and says, no, it isn't because of reason, da, 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 right? And Rabbi Akiva counters with another really clever argument. And this time, I'm trying to remember what it is, like maybe some doves burst down of his clothes, right? Again, like it's very obvious, right? The third time, Rabbi Gamaliel disputes the kashrut of the oven, and Rabbi Akiva answers it is, and then a voice comes down of heaven and says, Rabbi Akiva's right. And Rabbi Gamaliel says, but out. You gave us the Torah, now it's up to us to figure it out. And the story concludes, and God laughs because God had been bested by God's children. Quintessential rabbinic story.
Yeah.
Good one.
But out. Now, if you were at the synagogue, again, it's really interesting to think about how our Jewish brothers and sisters choose to study the Torah, right? It's understood you're going to disagree. It's understood, but it's not like you swap soliloquies like Congress does. It's understood you're going to disagree, but in disagreement, your positions both are going to modify. And the way the rabbi said this to us last year, whenever you have two Jews, you have three opinions. And he didn't mean that in the silly way. He meant you have a thesis, you have an antithesis, and then you have a synthesis. Both people's point of view have to be considered. Now, they may not come together, but they both leave modified because they've heard the other person. It's a lovely way to think about listening and learning that we don't do well. Christianity does not do that well. And maybe you can say that's why there's not uniformity of belief. So right from the beginning, right, I told you Judaisms don't necessarily have a uniformity of belief, even if they have a unity in liturgy or culture. And I would tell you, this is what people say about the Episcopal Church. We're not uniform in belief, we're unified in worship, or unified in mission. And I think even over the last 10 years, that's been more embraced, and people are struggling with it. And some people are very attracted by it, and some people are struggling with it. Clergy are struggling with it. And I'd say this is true whether we're in the Christian or Jewish or Muslim or Hindu tradition, right? Like, what does it mean to be unified without being uniform? I'll just chase this rabbit quickly and then I'll put it back in the hole, right? So the national church says same-sex marriage is a sacrament. Says that, right? That's in the canons of the national church. We're an open and affirming church. Here, we voted to do that. That's how it works. The vestry votes, that's how it works. I have colleagues that are absolutely against open and affirming. Like clergy that have been seminary who want to be priests since 2015 when we changed the canons. That's their position. I just think that's really weird. Sorry. I think that's weird. But that's where we are, and we struggle with, you know, because as a clergy person, I'm the gatekeeper for everything that happens here. I don't know if you know this, the vestry has no control over the facility at all. It's all the rector. So if I don't want a marriage happening, it didn't happen in here for any reason. So when you call a rector who is anti-LGBTQ, they can keep all that off. Maybe you want it that way, but the national canons don't want it that way. So this is what we're trying to figure out. How do we handle diversity even in welcome and acceptance? This is hard. And this may not even matter to 90% of the people. It may not, but some of us care about it deeply, right? And how we make meaning of it's really hard. And that is actually a really great example for how Judaism is truly trying to figure itself out. Not bound by belief, so how do you know when you've gone too far? Well, the answer is your mom's Jewish. That's all you need to know. And it can be really, really tough. I mentioned to you, Judaism in general is not proselytizing. It's not. How do you know if you're Jewish? Your mom was. I mean, that's really it. That's really how you know. Well, my mom wasn't Jewish, and my brother wants to be. So does he get to be are his Jewish credentials as good as somebody whose mother was Jewish? Well, I'll tell you, they're not. They're not. Like when my brother went to my father's funeral, it couldn't be at a church because he had converted out. So we did it at the funeral home, but he had to bring a chaperone with him to make sure he didn't engage in like the Christian part of the thing.
Wow.
Because he was a converso, to use the Ladino word. Converso is the Ladino word, right? Is it the same in Spanish? Yeah, okay. Converso, right? And this happened actually during the Inquisition, that a lot of Jewish people who had converted to Christianity were still tried and burned by the Inquisition so they could steal their things. I mean, that's just the sad truth of it, right? And so, like, it depends on what level you are and what level of it, you know, what premium you put on being a convert. Would his wife have needed a chaperone to come to my father's funeral? No, because her Jewish credentials were ironclad. Her mother was Jewish from Israel. But because he had converted from Christianity, he's not supposed to associate with Christianity in any way, including at a funeral. You may say, that could easily divide a family in half. Yeah, so does kosher food regulation.
Yeah.
Because my brother can't eat anything that comes out of my mother's kitchen, period. Nothing out the fridge, because there's been meat and dairy commingled. Nothing out the dishwasher, there's been meat and dairy commingled. The plates have had meat and dairy, and the ovens had meat and dairy. So when he visits, he brings a cooler and he eats out of his minivan. And you can do it. But you all know the best way to break a Southern mother's heart is not eat their food.
Oh, yeah.
And it's not like, hey, I hate you, or you're not good enough, but these create divisions. These do create divisions. Not being able to share a meal because the food you prepare isn't right. It's hard to hear that as a host, you know? What do you mean it's not right? Like, I put a lot of time and thought into this meal, right?
And in the Mormon church, they're going out after people have died and they're baptized.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's very lovely of them to do.
But could a Jewish person, after your mom passed away, convert her to Judaism?
No. And keep in mind, like, when you don't believe in hell, what's the big deal anyway?
Yeah.
I mean, Mormon people, they actually, like, there's something really, I don't know if you know this, most of what happens in the Mormon temple doesn't have a big room at all. That's the tabernacle, that's a big room. The temple is a bunch of little rooms. You don't get to go in there because you're not Mormon. You can go in before they consecrate it. So my wife went to the Mormon temple in San Diego that's modeled off the one in San Diego before they consecrated it. It's a bunch of little rooms. I mean, like 15 by 15. What do they do in those rooms? They baptize people on behalf of dead people so that they don't go to hell, because they really believe that. And they also believe God's compassionate enough that you can vicariously be baptized for somebody else and save them from hell. I mean, that's actually something really lovely when you stop and think about it. If you thought that was real, well, if somebody thinks of you and is baptized on your behalf, you don't have to go to hell. I mean, that's like lovely, right? But Jewish people don't buy it. Reminder, like no Jewish person is worried that I'm not keeping kosher. I have no worry about that. I'm not Jewish, I don't have to. As I mentioned, this is part of the wariness of conversion. If you convert, you have to. Why would you want to do that? We don't have a choice, but everybody else does, and God's fine with them. But we don't have a choice. So why would you choose a more stringent life than the one you have to? I mean, this is like one of the questions. Why would you want to be a fan of the Cleveland Browns? I mean, when you're born in Ohio, they're your team, right? But look, if you're born in San Diego, don't be a Browns fan.
If your brother was reformed or the liberal end of it,
If you were reformed, yeah.
yeah, would the same restrictions hold for the human?
I mean, I could be Reformed Jewish like tomorrow. I'm not putting them down. I actually kind of would love to be Reformed Jewish. Like the tradition and the community, like it's like so beautiful and compelling to me, actually.
Family dinners and.
Yeah, it is. It is. But keep in mind, if you're Reformed, what that means is the Torah is a human product. It's like liberal Protestant view, right, of scripture, right? So therefore, like we're studying it because it's a historical document, but it's not binding on us. If you're conservative, the Bible is infallible. You can rely on it, but it's also a cultural product. So you got to figure out when it's which. When is it giving me a command, a mitzvot, and when is it like no longer relevant? If you're Orthodox, it's inerrant. I mean, that's like the best bridge I can build between the two.
First Bible study teacher, whose name was Mike, by the way, talked to us about thinking Hebrew. And throughout the whole thing, it was really interesting because I'd never thought of that. I mean, either you believe it or you don't. I didn't. What you were talking about earlier about what you accept as factual and But that was interesting because it kind of solves some of the issues, conflicts, I guess, in the Bible. That they don't hold you to the details.
Yeah, I mean, like the way, keep in mind, since the temple's been destroyed in the year 70 of the Common Era on Tish B'Av, the rabbinic response has been, well, we're going to study about how to offer sacrifices at the temple. We're not going to do them, but we're going to study because they're pointing us to something beneath the reality themselves, right? So you could read this at the surface level. When you get ready to kill a turtle dove, do the following things to it, right? But that's not how people study in a synagogue. It's what does that mean? like what's the, for lack of a better word, like what's the figurative or poetic opportunity in that? Because we're not doing that. And since we're not and can't, this must mean something other than a literal rite. And we don't realize that like playfully reading the Bible and like the approach is the Bible's so important I can't play with it is a new idea. The old idea is it's so important we're commanded to play with it. Like we're commanded to see what we can extract from this text at 19 different levels because it's so significant. So we've kind of reversed tradition here in the last 100 years, if that makes sense. And it's hard to make that change. It's hard to make that change. I mean, like I grew up, the Bible's the word of God. It's just that like in our faith, it isn't. Like the word of God's Jesus.
That fundamentalism began 100 years ago.
Yeah, at the end of World War I, there were like essentially the Koch brothers of the time, some wealthy magnates in the United States were concerned that hey, Christianity was just getting too progressive and liberal and too educated, so we needed to go back to the fundamentals. They weren't educated, to be clear. Like they weren't theologians, they didn't go to seminary, they just were rich. And they probably were well-intentioned. So they made these pamphlets and widely distributed them, and they endowed university chairs with their money. And what do you know? Like now there's a lot of fundamentalism. It caught on.
Who were some of these people? I don't know.
Christian fundamentalists?
Yeah,
The early.
yeah. Know any of their names?
Well, I mean, I'm going to mention somebody older than those folks. Like, you ever heard of Jonathan Edwards?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Jonathan Edwards said his job was to scare the hell out of you
Yes.
by making you convert, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a fundamentalist point. One of the fundamentals is hell is a real place. Hey, who is another fundamentalist? You ever heard of John Calvin?
Oh, yes.
He had 5 points of fundamentalism, didn't he? TULIP. You know about this 5-point Calvinism? Now, Calvin himself didn't come up with this acronym, but he basically said, hey, here's the fundamentals of Christianity, total depravity of human beings. There's nothing good in us. Oh, yeah. Hey, that showed up in Christianity in the 1300s. Started to show up. Definitely true of fundamentalism. There's no good in us. All of our righteousness is filthy rags to God. Like, this is the kind of thing. Total depravity since the fall. That's point one. What is you? Unlimited. No. I'm struggling on that. I is irresistible grace. When God chooses you, you have no choice. And if God doesn't choose you, you have no choice. You're going to hell.
So it's predestination.
It is predestination. P is not for predestination. It's for perseverance of the saints. This is a very strange thing. Calvin said, like, God chooses you, you have no choice. God picks some to go to heaven and some go to hell. But if God picked you, you're going to do good works, which is where the Protestant work ethic came from. I'm going to prove I'm chosen by like working my butt off, right? Which is where the saying Protestants eat better and Catholics sleep better. Do you know that one? Protestants eat better, Catholics sleep better. Yeah. Limited atonement is L. Limited atonement. I'm trying to think what U is. I always forget U.
Universal, no?
No, it's not universal.
No.
I think it's unconditional. I think it's unconditional atonement. So we're totally depraved. God's atonement's unconditional, but it's limited, it's irresistible, and you have to persevere to show you've been picked.
I wonder if the rise of fundamentalism was kind of a response to the rise in popularity of communism and socialism around the same time.
Probably a social factor for sure, right? I mean,
Those are big capitalists. They want to keep their money, and they probably see that as a threat. See fundamentalism as a way to keep their money.
yeah, and hey, it's really important to remember that there was this Jewish guy that was real involved in that called Karl Marx, right? And sometimes we don't realize that even though like 0.1% of the world is Jewish, like the IP of Judaism in the world is like way higher than 0.1%. Most influential thinker of the 20th century, probably Sigmund Freud, right? What do you know? Jewish. Karl Marx, sure, right? Like incredibly well-known and influential Jewish thinkers. And Karl Marx said religion was the opiate of the masses as a Jew, not as an atheist.
How do they know that they've been chosen? Is there a sign, or how, or do?
Yeah, glad
how
you
did they
said
know?
that. Well, I mean, essentially that's what the Torah says. And keep in mind, chosen for what? Not better than other people, but you have to live this way.
Okay,
So we always have this like kind of Christian envy, like, what do you mean you're the chosen people? You think you're better than us? And the answer is, we have to do stuff you don't have to do. Not because we're better, it's because God said we got to do it this way. So on the outside looking in, we think being chosen and being elect is like being special. Well, you got special rules, which is again, why would you want that? And sure enough, because of like, hey, this understanding that chosen means better, and you've got these special rules, what our food's no good for you, that has fed anti-Semitism for a long time. Like, oh, you're trying to be different from us. Must because you think you're better. Yeah. Okay, well, maybe that's all I got. Now, if you have more questions on Judaisms, I'll do my best. We can do them down the road, but as I mentioned, we'll come back on November the 15th, and we'll start Christianities. And we need to put an S on it, because I don't think there's one. I don't think there's one Christianity. I think there's Christianities. Just like there's Judaism. Oh, by the way, if you're interested in challah, please help yourself.